Okay, so without further ado, let's call the Prime Minister to open up the debate. Here.
Yeah, just to confirm again, is this visible and audible?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. He, him pronouns if you need to address me. 3, 2, 1. It's our last year, we're going to win. 2 arguments from proposition. First, how this deletes every form of oppression and discrimination, and essentially the suffering of humans that we have seen retrospectively in history. Number 2, how we create a more wealthy and youthful society. But the first thing I want to do is just give you a general layout of what this road is likely to look like. Number 1, obviously this is a preferred motion. This applies from the start of time. Number 2 is that this overrides other narratives. All individuals innately use this to identify themselves and others, and because everyone buys into it, this forms a super dominant narrative in which there are probably no room for other norms, for example, like the one in the status quo, to kick in. The most important thing here, what would this world actually look like? We think that people are going to place communal values over other things. We're more likely going to have things like equal resource distribution, insofar as you see everyone else as for example, having innate value, as having innate, like, for example, potential, which means that we're more likely to give everyone an equal level of access to resources, or at least try to break free from things like financial barriers or social stratification in general. We're also unlikely, because of that, to have things like private property, because the status quo is, for example, if there's a net unit of, for example, 100 units of resources, we're more likely to distribute 1 unit to 1 person, unlike the status quo where 1 person has access to 99 units of resources and everyone else has to share the 1. First argument, how does this delete every form of oppression and discrimination that we have seen until now? Why does this happen, and why did this happen in the status quo? 4 things. First, we are aspirational and always live in coexistence with others. This means that we discriminate people relationally as well. The concept of being worse or inferior are both in comparison, which means that we discriminate others not because they're, for example, innately bad, but because we think that they're inferior to other social groups, that we're better than them, and this is why we have the right to discriminate them. Number 2, the intrinsic implications of believing in specialty, which is the norm that opposition has to defend. Because special means that you have some sort of innate characteristic or ability which distinguishes you from others, which also provides the justification to treating others differently. So even if you don't see the other people as worse than you see yourself as better than others, which means that discrimination will probably happen. Number 3, we feel a strong sense of responsibility towards people who we consider as proximate to us. For example, the vast majority of people in this round and in, for example, society would probably consider their families and friends, for example, to be ones they have larger social responsibilities against. For instance, we emphasize the concept that I most likely have to pay for the funeral of my mother, but I probably don't have to pay for the funeral of like a random man on the streets. This is because we often weigh things like responsibility, often decide the way in which we treat people based on proximity, based on, for example, the social groups that we are correlated with. This changes on our side, because regardless of who it is, you view them as someone who holds equal significance. You view them as someone who you have an equal level of responsibility towards, because they are not intrinsically less valuable or less quote-unquote special than others. Fourth of all, we eliminate the impact of things like social, economic, and human factors that I know opposition will talk about. Because obviously, sure, people are probably going to have different skin colors. People are probably going to have things like different financial status, even if that is the case that we have to defend. Things like sexual identity, things like religion. But even if there are differences like that, I don't think that they matter at the end of the day in our world. Because the thing is, in the status quo, if you have a different skin color to another person, you use that as a reason to justify discriminating against them. So people think that because they have a different skin color from me, this is why I'm special, and they're not. This changes on our side, because you think that having a different skin color does not affect this narrative that you have bought into and maybe given the fiat of this motion. You think that everyone is equal regardless. You should not think that yourself is more special than others, which means that all these other arbitrary factors, even though they exist, are unlikely to manifest as in a toxic way as they do in the status quo. What is the impact of this? This effectively erases all the retrospective harms of historical events caused because of this. Things like wars, caused because leaders of nations or nations themselves believed that they were superior to others and had the right to conquer other nations. Things like the Holocaust, where Hitler basically believed that a certain race is superior to everything else and that they're special. Things like religious conflicts, where different religions and the leaders of these religions believe that they're more special and like had more specialty. We eliminate all that suffering given all the reasons that I gave. Second independent argument, how do we create a more wealthy and youthful society? I want to posit a thought experiment here regarding the veil of ignorance. If everyone was put into this like reset of reality, where there's an option of number 1, in living in a world where there's like 1% chance that you're going to be incredibly rich, or a 99% chance that you're going to be not that rich, or a world where there's basically an equal distribution of resources to everyone, where everyone has the access to an equal amount of resources. People are going to choose the latter. Why is this the case? This is what I'm going to explain in this argument. Firstly, humanity has faced a massive opportunity cost up until now. This is because, sure, there might be certain people who were able to succeed, like, I don't know, people like Albert Einstein, but this is not the case for a vast majority of people who were not able to succeed because of things like an unequal distribution of resources, also things like structural barriers caused by all the forms of social stigma that I talked about in my previous argument, which means that even if you have some sort of ability, you could not shine because society does not consider you to be special, society does not give you opportunities, and it is intrinsically impossible for you to actually do something even if you're talented in these scenarios. They're limited on our side because you get an equal distribution of resources, even if you're rich, even if you're seen as like, I don't know, more handsome or any of these arbitrary factors, people still distribute resources equally insofar as they believe that everyone is equal, insofar as they believe that everyone has innate value and the right to access these resources. But on utility, we think that the biggest harm in the status quo is when people suffer, when people starve to death, when people, for example, do not have money to send their children to the hospital when they are sick. We eliminate that on our side of the house because effectively redistribute resources and guarantee some sort of access to these services on our side. Because again, we don't think that people should not have, for example, an access to these things because they're poor, because they're not so special as we define in our society, but because they're equal and because they have an equal stake and right to access these things, more likely to be able to have a relatively more equal distribution of resources, if not a completely equal distribution of resources, which means that, sure, people at the top might be less happy, but we guarantee that suffering at the bottom is going to be the leader. What do you have to remember at the end of this speech? It's simple. We save billions of people from poverty, we save trillions of people from painful and unnecessary deaths, and our entire species from the concept of specialty that has shackled us for far too long. Propose.
Okay, thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. Now, to open the case for opposition, I call upon the leader of opposition to the podium. Here.
All right. Hi, my name is Singan, and I'll be both the LO and the opposition reply for this debate. First, I've never done this before, but shout out to all the SNT coaches and all the SNT teams that came along in this tournament. And yeah, I hope this is a fun debate. All right, without further ado, I'll take you guys to visual signs, and my gender pronouns are he, him. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Under government's role, to live the same is to live in a dystopia. With that said, 3 things I'm going to do my speech today. First, a little bit of setup, second, rebuttals, and third, our constructives. Let's go right away into our setup in terms of what the world will look like. So let's do a little bit of world building. We think that in terms of the economic conditions, it'll look more like a communist system. In terms of the social conditions, things like education will be standardized and opportunities would be randomized at birth by the government. But third, in terms of political conditions, we would see things like for policies, you would have referendum because you would still think that policies can be compared to one another because they're not human, but rather they're just words on paper. But things like actual representatives and government leaders will be chosen by lotteries or by random by the public, and it won't be a voting procedure and there won't be elections. All this goes to show that in principle, you suppress differences and individuals' differences on government's role. Compared to our world, where you'll say that people are born special, they are born with certain unique talents that characterize themselves. And additionally, on top of being born with those talents, they're able to maximize that through certain opportunities and through certain career paths under our world exclusively. Before I go into any constructives, let's go over a main rebuttal here. We hear Alvin say that that differences ultimately don't matter. Sure, we concede that under their world, there isn't going to be any discrimination. But just because there's no social movement and just because there's no discrimination doesn't mean that the problem still doesn't exist anymore. That's okay, because the true problem here is that there's still going to be people born with disabilities or clear differences from the majority of society. The main issue here is that you can't help these people anymore, because you helping them is a sign that you're acknowledging that they're inferior and that they need help. And we would say that therefore you aren't able to help the most vulnerable. I talk more about this in my second argument. With that all put aside, let's go right into our constructives on first of all, why development will become slow and inefficient under government rule. 4 layers of analysis here. A, why do methods of evaluation disappear? Things like grades, your performance, your talents, or your achievements are going to be heavily compared. And all these evaluation factors ultimately determine who's special or who's better in society. But B, the capacity and the incentive for competition decreases. Let's go through each of these. First, on capacity, you can't compare because you don't have anything to compete on in the first place. But more importantly, institutions that originally build your capacity and build your skill sets no longer exist under your world. Things like education, which are usually meant to empower and maximize the unique skills of each student, no longer happens. Because on government, everyone is either taught the same lesson or everyone is just taught the jobs or skill sets that they're recommended by the government to do. Because again, you aren't able to pursue your skills because that's a sign that you're better than someone you are or seen as more special. Regardless of what it is, there's no control or agency under their world, and this is why it's important, and that's why they lose this debate. But second of all, I'll take you later. Instead of capacity, let's go into incentive. First, let's do a little bit of comparing. Because you comparing that means that you have the potential to improve and become better. But the average person would say that you push down people and see what are the consequences on development under their role. First of all, no, people who are originally smart and skilled are no longer work because they don't have the incentive to improve. You're not able to maximize because note that people are going to still be born with desires and birth skills. Even if you have this narrative that isn't like genetic engineering, they don't have that type of fiat in this debate anyways, meaning that they are still born with human natures. They are still born with human desires. But second of all, certain industries will no longer exist under their role because things like athletes, either where you're comparing a viewer to an athlete or athlete between a better athlete, things like sports or acting would also fall apart. But third, in terms of things like products, you have minimized spending patterns or consumer patterns because you can't, and now under their world, you can't say that this person who has that product A is better than this person with product B, meaning that we think that this development is also heavily put down aside under their world. Then a little bit of weight in our side. We would say that no development would directly harm the people, but more importantly, it will result in people dying. We think that, for example, things like medicine or public services are now limited and they can't be maximized to help the people who actually need help. On terms of agency, it lacks on their side. We can see that under our world, we have an illusion of agency. Sure, not everyone has freedom of choice under our world as well. But at least on their side, compared to government, where there's no agency at all, people will always have self-interest and desires that they cannot pursue, such as hobbies, job, and career paths. Moving on to the second constructive then on why this results to suppression of the mass. And before I go into any analysis, sure, I'll take the POI.
Throughout history, how has opportunities for innovation been distributed across society?
We would say that in history, the people who had certain skill sets or have certain talents would pursue those opportunities that come to them. We would say that those opportunities, and under their world, it becomes random, meaning that now certain people aren't able to achieve that. With this, let's go around into our first analysis of our second argument, why people will become corrupt under their world. Let's take a little bit of characterization is that you still need people to run this system. People in these positions are in a position where, because now people who do enter government positions can now see the how everything is controlled. And also, because we characterize to you that things like selfish interest and desires still exist, we think that this will only result in further potential chances of exploitation, which leads me to my second point on why this is necessarily bad. Because things like corruption can result in oppression or manipulation of the masses. It's easy to fool people because you have this very strong narrative that everyone is the same. So people on the ground will apply the same standard to the government as well. Why are people not going to protest or rebel under their will? Because you rebelling is a sign that you think your system that you're trying to propose is better than the currently existing system, like the currently existing president or administration or whatnot. Then how does this harm the most vulnerable? You can help your disabled friend because you're implying that they're inferior and place of a need. You aren't able to help the most vulnerable. And finally, a little bit of weight. If this pushes down all people, discrimination isn't as relevant because people all suffer equally and disenfranchised, the one born with different needs. That's why we win this debate. Our world is competitive, caring, and case winning. That's why we win this debate. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that speech. Now I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue on the case of the government. Hear, hear.
Hi, can you hear me and see me?
Yep, you're good.
Cool. Three, two, one. I'm going to ask 3 questions in this speech. First, in terms of what exactly is our counterfactual. 2, in terms of why we better oppression on our side. And 3rd, why in principle, this world was a far more justified world than the world of opposition that they need to stand by of the status quo. First, in terms of why of our counterfactual, I want to clarify something important at the top of this question, that their language to characterize our world of resources will be distributed based on arbitrary and random factors is not necessarily true. In the absence of specialty of individuals, you don't distribute resources randomly, you probably distribute it equally across all individuals. They need to engage with that counterfactual. 2, their main push in terms of what our world looks like is that when people lose specialty, people are a lot less motivated in life. There are a number of things to note here. First, motivations in life do not only stem from your desire to feel special. Even as an average non-special person, you have motivations to care for your family, pursue what makes you happy. Sure, the desire to feel special contributes to motivation, but there are many other factors at play that exist symmetrically on our side how we think motivation is symmetric at best. But 2, their second push is that people cannot pursue their unique skills on our side when specialty is no longer a factor that defines the individual identities of individuals. That's not true too, because each skill is seen as unique on our side how, but our world is much more nuanced. That even if all skills are seen as unique, we attribute equal value to all of these skills. So maybe Alex's skills of being able to be very good at debate, but my skills being good at math, for instance, are different in value. They're seen as unique, but we attribute different symmetric values and equal values to all of these traits. We still do allow individuals to develop equal traits. The implication of this is simple, that 1, we are able to plot their impact of innovation if that's what they want to claim, but 2, and this is important, that what's the benefit of innovation if they're used in wars, and 2, that they're dictated by the rich. That was a world that we opposed on our side. The comparative was far better. Second question in terms of oppression. And I want to answer this question in 2 ways. 1, in terms of the oppression of people on an individual level, and 2, on oppression retrospectively, a clash that they've not engaged with in that first speech. First, in terms of oppression on an individual level, because the main push that they say is that you cannot help people who are vulnerable because it is a sign that they're inferior. So even if there are vulnerable individuals on our side, you're unable to help these individuals. I'll pitch later. 1, everyone requires some sort of assistance or help from society. It's not about the degree of it, but your equal right to claim it. So even though so crucially, the important thing to note here is that this question was not necessarily about your degree to help individuals, but it was about how all individuals have an equal right to claim assistance from individuals in society. That's what we uniquely provided. The comparative on their side was simple, that all individuals, that everyone needs assistance, but only a small minority of individuals in society can claim that. We thought that was unjust. But 2, that even if that response does not stand, people won't be vulnerable people won't be vulnerable on our side house for reasons of the status quo. Racism won't exist on our side house. Those vulnerable individuals that they claim we are unable to help won't exist on our side in the first place. The reason why individuals or ethnic minorities, for instance, are vulnerable within status quo is because of the distinction that they are special. On our side, we get rid of that distinction. They're no longer the more vulnerable individuals in this debate. Second, in terms of oppression retrospectively, this is the second part of this speech. Because crucially, even if everything in this debate has been a wash so far, we won on how we benefit society retrospectively. Because crucially, this is a this-half prefers motion, which seems to be a part of the motion that Alt missed, which means that this happens from the beginning of time. From the beginning of time, all individuals are seen as equal on our side of the house. What did that mean? Because war and atrocities such as World War II throughout history was built on the narratives of superiority. That Hitler's rise to power was justified via the claims of inferiority of Jewish individuals. We prevent these narratives from manifesting on our side. Hitler would have never risen to power, and you can never justify these kinds of atrocities on our side. The impacts of this were very, very simple. That 1, we would have been able to prevent atrocities of ethnic minorities, such as the Holocaust. That means millions of lives saved on our side that are killed on theirs. But 2, that crucially, because of this retrospective aspect of this debate, the implication is that even if they're able to claim things like innovation, it's oftentimes used in ways that further these wars and make these wars far more pernicious than otherwise be. Innovation is not an inherent impact of this debate, especially if it led to developments such as the atomic bomb. Those are things that we strictly opposed. Third, in principle, why this is strictly unjustified. Before that, though, Cheryl, take a point.
You have a government under your rule?
No. So importantly, on our side house, we don't have to stand for things like the government. Crucially, the reason why things like governments exist is because of an identity of superiority. On our side, we don't have to necessarily stand for those things. But two, the better response here is that even if we do indeed have to stand for things like governments, maybe individuals are in places of power, but that power is no longer held as a special trait. That power or that position of a government is attributed equal value to any other individual that existed within society. Very odd POI. Third, in terms of in principle, why this is a justified claim. The problem within status quo is that arbitrary factors that stem from specialty determine your outcome in life. The fact that you are rich gives you a special status that allows you to get more education than a stranger beside you. The fact that you are white allows you to live without the fear of microaggressions and being shot by a police, a fear that minorities oftentimes have to live with on their side of the house. Void of any practical outcome, it is unjustified that people start at different points in life. Importantly, people don't consent to the starting point in life. They don't consent to be born in a specific family. They don't consent to be born as a specific ethnicity. What we really noted was it's important that all individuals are seen as equal, have resources distributed equally to these individuals. It's much greater that we give all people a fair starting point in life that they uniquely lack on their side of the house. In conclusion, proposition in this debate uses the specialty of many to lubricate the gears of social utility. They're flushed as a stepping stone for others, and we thought that was unjustified.
Okay, thank you, DPM, for that speech. Now I call upon the DLO to continue the case of the opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I both audible and visible?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, if they have a POI sign, they can raise that. If not, you can just wave at the screen. If everyone's ready, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem with our government side is that they pick and choose or cherry pick necessarily what impacts of this new world that they want. Note that because this is a new world, they cannot define it. It's not a policy motion as to what specific solutions we want to persist, which is why to live the same is to live in dystopia. Very proud to quote. I'm going to give you a few clarifications before firstly explaining why development is the most important metric in this debate and why they feel this. Secondly, why even if we look at social opportunities, it's largely likely to be worse on their world. And lastly, I'm going to give you an extension on why individuals are much more likely to internalize the blame, and therefore you are not able to achieve social change in the case where something goes wrong. Let's start with these clarifications, because as I already tell you, they exclusively pick the metrics that are beneficial to them. So when Ethan tells you that it's not random, it's equal, we understand that they have misunderstood Singan's characterization. We're not telling you that you're going to randomly give some people more money and then randomly give other people less money. What we mean is that the way that you classify and categorize people is going to be immediately random. So if they do have a government, then it's going to be that the government representatives are chosen out of a lottery, because you inherently conceding that someone has more capacities to be a leader is conceding that that person is special enough to be able to lead your community. I'll take you a bit later, which is why them saying that you will be still able to maximize individual traits is something that is inherently contradictory. Because if I say that Hannah is good at math and I am good at, I don't know, like arts, then you are conceding that you are distinct and unique. Note that this debate wasn't only about being special. If you note the wording of the info sign and the motion, it's also about being distinctive or different. And that's exactly what happens when you concede that each other have different traits. It's not just about the net value of it, but just the objective fact that you are different as an individual. First, let's talk about development though, because I'm going to give you 3 main claims against the challenges that they had. I'll take you later. First thing that they told us was that there's an imbalance of opportunities, which is why they're able to prevent millions of people being killed because you don't have as much conflict. First, note that the reason why there's no imbalance of opportunities is because no one has these opportunities in the first place. So it looks like special classifications like doctors or artists are all being randomly placed because you don't want to recognize that some person is inherently better at that job than others. For me to say that you should be an artist because you are good at art and you should be a doctor because you are good at memorizing is inherently conceding that some people are more developed or more special within certain talents compared to other people. So the jobs that require skill will still fail under their will because you will randomly and inherently place them. If I become a doctor and I have no memorization skills whatsoever, or if I have like a shaking hand disorder, then I will not be able to perform surgery, which actively kills people, meaning that this type of basic development or societal function cannot happen under their will in the first place. But second, let's talk about the way that you're able to be happy and motivated under their will, because they tell you that this doesn't exactly equate to desire. Note that they never give you the mechanism for this, which is why, for personally, I'm going to tell you that as Sing has already characterized, human nature is to necessarily compare, which is why we have so much comparison within our current status quo, and even things like competition, or why we have better industries, or why we have advertisements that tell you without this product you are necessarily incomplete. The reason why we have these structures within the first place is because of our innate desire to compare and innate desire to rank. They don't explain, or they don't mechanize to you why even without this you're still able to be happy. But second, note that this never actualizes within the first place, because you having a different hobby to someone else is inherently recognizing that you are good at certain things. So for instance, you liking piano because you learned it as a child is something that is distinct and unique about you as an individual. You liking to draw because you are inherently talented at it is because you were talented or you were born that way, which is also again acknowledging the individual characteristics that people have. This itself is contradictory to their world. Also, last, let's talk about this development versus discrimination, because this is the main thing that they push you. The reason why it's necessarily not a value positive under their world that they don't have discrimination is because discrimination is born from differences. Note how they give you no engagement as to how competitive nature and in the development of industries happens much better under our world. Because without differences, you cannot set a standard as to how to improve. You cannot improve without the type of necessary comparison. If you say one product is better than the other product, then you are inherently analyzing that the creator of this product is more talented or more skilled than the creator of this other product. So the scope and scale of harm is far worse under their rule if everyone dies, or no one is able to have a properly functioning society and suffers or starves or whatnot, as Alvin tells you. Before I go on, I'll take a POI.
Innovation on your side means bombs used against others you view as less superior. Why exactly is this good?
Okay, I want you to recognize that the reason why we have a lot of wars is not because we are able to only develop technology, but it's because people have bad incentive to use this technology. I think Simon already tells you in her second argument why we necessarily still have people who are able to get out of this frame from the point at which you're placed in the position of power. Because if you are an individual in the position of power and you recognize that you have the ability to make these decisions, that's when you think, oh, I have an opportunity to become better than other individuals because I dictate individuals whatever to do. That's the point in which the same, the same controversies of you actively trying to suppress other people or exploiting your society will still exist because you recognize that you have the capacity to do so. And oftentimes humans are inherently greedy and inherently malicious, which is why individuals like Hitler exist. If Hitler was a nice person, he wouldn't have committed genocide in the first place. But second, let's talk about these social opportunities. But because what they tell you in response to a second argument is that all individuals have the equal right or assistance to help, which is why this help is going to exist even for individuals who are born or genetically different. The reason why this isn't true is because exactly you provide it based on the average individual's right to what existed, not the different or the deviation. So you actively creating things like crutches, you saying that mentally disabled people need different learning or educational opportunities is exactly acknowledging that they are different from the average or the standard opportunity that people need. So the level of assistance that you need is different. But furthermore, note that because you have a randomly assigned government or you have randomly assigned individuals to different positions, you cannot always assume that these individuals would then be able to fulfill this out in a meaningful way, which is why the arbitrary standards they tell you to success is far worse under their work, from the point at which you need to rely on arbitrary standards unless you want to be framed as a government that supports individualism, unless you want to be framed as a government that supports individual characteristics and specialty. The reason why this matters over the justice that they tell you is because justice doesn't tangibly impact people's lives. But if you aren't able to act out of your own agency, if you aren't even able to choose what exactly you want to do, that's the point in which you actively and tangibly feel that you have been constrained by the government. We tell you that this is far worse, very practically.
Okay, DLO, thank you for that speech. Yeah, we have a bit of a technical issue, so we'll start the government whip speech in about 10 seconds.
Am I allowed to start?
Just a second, please.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry.
Okay, so we have slightly an issue before, so we need to resolve before we proceed. So, Team Unemployed, are you currently using post-its on the table? Yes, so according to the rules of this tournament, we don't allow using post-its. We only allow using white paper during the debate. So yeah, it would be great if you stop using post-its from now. And yeah, please clear up the post-its on the desk. And yeah, if it is also okay for the government, we will just proceed and finish this round for the grand finals. Would that be okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's completely fine. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, then the government whip, you can start your speech whenever you're ready.
All right. Since Seung-won did shout outs, I don't usually do this as well, but I'll shout out a couple of people. I want to shout out my WSTC teammates, especially Arthur, because he's leaving for college now. And all the people, our friends and teachers that helped us. And if you can hear me, he and pronouns, visual POIs, and I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the greatest cause of human suffering is the inherent desire to catalyze and justify superiority. The belief that the tears of someone matters less based on the number of zeros they have in their bank account. The belief that the blood of someone matters less based on the hue and color of their skin. The belief that the desperate calls to preserve one's dignity matters less based on who they want to love, where they call home, and what they define as happiness. The law of Jante pulls down this thick veil of superiority and speciality from our eyes to grant our vision what is most important about humanity, dignity and equality. I'm going to talk about two things in this speech. Firstly, where is oppression and discrimination lessened? And second, where is there higher social development? Firstly, on oppression. I want to note in this round, and you can check your own notes, Judge, opposition has a terrifyingly and embarrassing lack of response to our point about oppression and discrimination. When they respond to our arguments, the only proper response was from first opposition, that somehow the problem still exists. And then second opposition strategy is not to engage with the crux of the argument, but circulate back to their own argument about innovation, which we noted in Ethan was not necessarily a good thing. Innovation has killed people because some people believe that they're special, that some people deserve to die and be crushed by bombs. These are reasons that we gave to you even down our bench that does not get response. But I'll respond to their first response, which was the only response that we get, is that the problem still exists, that people with differences will still exist and they won't be able to be helped because it is a sign that they are inferior. This is not true, because the reason why the problem exists is because even if differences exist, people catalyze on those differences and people believe that they're superior based on those differences. The examples that we pointed to are things like racism and sexism. Obviously, it is true that still people on our side will be born in a specific race and born in a specific skin color. But that is not the problem. The problem is some people that are white, some people that have a brighter color of skin discriminate based on those differences. Things like sexism, where sure, people are still born as a specific gender or specific sex on our side of the house, but that does not mean that that can be used as a way to grant legitimacy based on sexual-based violences and things like patriarchal societies. That was the difference between the two sides, and that was the bar that opposition never met. But second, even if we do not perfectly help these people, there are two reasons why we still win on oppression and discrimination. A, that even if the most disabled are not perfectly helped on our side, that it is still far better. That note retrospectively, disabled people have become violently killed, massacred, and oppressed based on those differences. They are viewed as different and inferior. At least on our side, we remove that bias and we remove that stereotypes, which means that their opportunities are far less likely to be influenced by this bias. The obvious example is that someone that is disabled still exists on our side, but that disabled person that applies for a job on their side is rejected or oftentimes covered with biases. On our side, even if there is an active assistance from society, it is still far likely that they're able to independently progress based on those differences that they have. That is why we clearly win on oppression and discrimination, and it was damning that they had a lack of response for this. The implication of this is very simple. Innovation matters. Sure, the end extent of their second argument of how sports matters in our society. But what is far more important is that retrospectively, we have less people dying, we have less people being slaves, we have less people being oppressed by governments that justify their oppression based on the fact that they have been born in a different way, that they are inherently superior. Even if we grant them all of their benefits, being very charitable on things like social development, We've proven to you why development is not necessarily what is the most important in this round and for society. That creating new technology does not matter if one more single mother is dying because she doesn't have enough food to put on her table for her children and her family. Those are the actors that we alleviate the most vulnerable, and we were far okay with trading off innovation. But second, even if we have to win on innovation, I want to point out where's their higher social development and note the type of wording that we use. We never said that more social development is actually a good thing, but the types of social development that we get are far more nuanced. Their first argument under theme 2 is that for some reason, they have innovation. We flipped this and we got no response from side opposition. We've proven to you that development is oftentimes due to random factors, things like where you are geographically, or things like what type of resources that you have access to. It isn't necessarily about you are special in that specific way. But second, that innovation actually retrospectively has been hindered due to these biases of speciality. That if you believe that someone is specifically special, that is exactly why you won't give allocation of resources or allocation of opportunities to people that you believe as less special. And that was the important difference, that opportunity cost is why innovation, even if less, is likely to be distributed across society far better on our side. The weighing is very, very simple. That even if innovation is slower, innovation is not important when it creates a net harm. When the innovation or the opportunities and impacts and the extent of that innovation is only accessible by a few that believe that they're special, that believe that they deserve this innovation. Even if we have less innovation, the qualitative impact of that innovation is far better on our side. The final thing I want to do, which is the only thing left of the opposition case, is respond to their burden push that everything will be random on our side of the house. That is not true. Ethan's POI pointed to the fact that even if we have to defend worlds in which governments do not exist, that is necessarily something that we're willing to defend. Because instead of governments randomly selected based on the fact that you were born into a rich family, based on the fact that you feel special because of the fact that you are a politician, necessarily is far worse in terms of corruption and what they said we need to defend than everyone communally living, resources distributed equally across society. Even if that's the extent we need to defend, we are far pleased to defend that than the status quo. That is why, firstly, not everything is random, because randomness and the privilege of that randomness was still viewed as uniqueness according to their own logic. But second, even if everything is random, taking them at their very, very best, that is far better than their society, where that randomness actually led to a privilege that is damning towards the quality of life for people. Very proud to stand on proposition.
Okay, thank you, Government Whip, for that speech. Now we would like to finish up the opposition constructive case by calling upon the opposition whip to the podium. Here.
Okay, just give me one moment. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. It's not that we don't respond to their point on discrimination. It's that we can see that there are tragedies that have happened in status quo in our world. We see that there have been wars. We can see that there has been oppression to a certain extent. We don't reject this. But the world that what we need to importantly characterize here is that our world is not forever injustice and just slavery. Slavery in itself has already been abolished. These things no longer exist. We are working towards things like getting more equality for people who are minorities. We are working towards things like developing social movements, giving them more capital, making sure that people who are vulnerable are doing these things. What they need to know on their side is that the oppression that we characterize to that exists exclusively on their side and gets no response exists forever insofar as this perception also exists forever. It's uniquely on our side where there's a potential and a capacity to change that we wanted to clarify to you was the most important. 2 other things I want to clarify. Firstly, on their side, they can't opt for things like there are social assistance to disabled people. Because we would say, you do recognize everyone's right to assistance on their side. But if you help someone more than others, that in itself is recognizing the differences that exist within people, which they cannot do under this motion. At best, you might be able to give disabled people help because everything has to be equal as they frame it to be. You also have to give help to non-disabled people. This means if there's an inequality that already exists, you just hire the inequality, but you don't actually bridge the gap because you give the same resources to everyone inherently in itself. The third thing I would know, if we focus on Alex's last analysis, on this communal building that occurs, if you only focus on your community, that's exactly why things like racism occurs. Because if you were born like this white community, you only focus on whatever is in that community, then the moment you see someone who's like Black, that's the moment in which it becomes division between your own communities. Obviously something that is far more worse on their side. First touch then on discrimination. And I want to note here, most crucially, on their side, there's an assumption that people are born equal, which is why they were supposed to prosper when given equal treatment. But we told you this premise was wrong in its entirety. There are people with physical disabilities. There are people with mental disabilities. These are already things that exist on their side. But insofar as they cannot do things like giving extra assistance to disabled people that bridges the gap, as opposed to just hiring the two people, what happens on their side exclusively for individuals is that you end up internalizing that blame in itself. If you believe that you were supposed to be born equal, but you see yourself performing worse in certain things as opposed to other people, you cannot obviously speak out or change society because everyone lives like the same life. You end up inherently conceding that has to be a problem with yourself inherently, that is a you problem, but not a society who failed to help you problem in itself. They cannot only debate on their best case of discrimination, where society will always cater to the needs of different people, which is inherently contradictory with their own premise. What is that we push to you? The question I pushed to you was on the incentive discrimination. That discrimination spawns from wanting self-benefit or selfish interest. So no, like things like racism and things like sexism, it did not spawn from people believing that they were different. It spawned from the elites who wanted to utilize these narratives and capitalize on it so they could benefit themselves in itself. We inherently study discriminatory systems in society and status quo. We don't deny this, but this is because the elite wanted to benefit off the suffering of the masses. But this incentive did not spawn from the perception that people are different. Racism and sexism were just convenient narratives that you utilize. What they fail to engage with is why a social norm is able to overtake those biological instincts of humans to want the best for themselves. That is where the impact of corruption and oppression comes in. When you randomly lottery pick individuals to form the government that they concede to having within their POI, what ends up happening is these people feel the power that they can potentially have. They end up wanting to utilize it for themselves benefit, because inherently within our own incentives to want to use these things for our own benefit at the end of the day. Second point though, we would tell you furthermore that the weighing here is incredibly important on the long term. We concede all the retrospective harms that have happened in status quo. Why was this okay? Over time, our society gets better. We see things like social movements. We see increased welfare programs. We see increased awareness around differences, trying to accept people, trying to accept that inequality. Over time, their society gets worse. At best, if it stays the same, those with physical and mental disabilities, those who are born with a weaker body and a lower IQ, will always suffer as vulnerable individuals on their side. There is no capacity for change. And there is no capacity for change here because they also don't prove this on their side. But at worst, what happens is that people end up becoming power hungry over time. Certain people in governments who you randomly lottery pick are able to feel the taste for power, are able to feel the taste for what potential better lives they can pursue for their own happiness. And these are all things that end up feeding into the cycle of corruption and oppression that happens on their side. On their side, there's far more oppression, far more manipulation. On a realistic example of this, just look at North Korea, where everyone's under the illusion that you're able to have things like equality, but it is fairly inconsistent insofar as elites are the often ones who capitalize on this. I'll take that POI.
Given your own consensus down the bench, do you think tragic events like the Holocaust and the Japanese colonization of South Korea was a justified and good thing that you're willing to concede?
We don't think it's justified. We don't think it's justified. But what we're telling you is that we minimize those events on our side in the future. Do you see events like the Holocaust happening right now? Obviously, no. On your side, those events have a higher potential because elites can farther utilize these kinds of narratives that affect the masses. When you're able to do things like, say, when you're giving your own analysis like community building, if you see a different community, then obviously you're going to start saying like, oh, but we thought we were the best in itself. You were obviously different. So you have far more increased opportunities for those things. Secondly, and more importantly though, on development, what we told you here is what they tell you here is that individuals can pursue different things but place equal value to each skill. So like a doctor and being a lawyer is the same thing inherently. This is untrue, obviously, because if you pursue different things, then individuals develop the perception of difference. But even if it was that everyone has an inherent value or skill that they can pursue, there's no analysis as to why the incentive to pursue that exists. We gave you 3 layers of analysis as to why there's an inherent incentive for competition on our side. And it essentially boils down to the perception that you have the potential to be better than others. This potential to be better than others is what pursues you and motivates you to do better. This is what does not exist on their side. That means on their side, you have things like single monopolies within fields. So things that so maybe you don't compare doctors and lawyers, but you still compare within the field of lawyers who can be the better lawyer on our side. On their side, you have things like one brand of medicine that is never able to be developed. On their side, you have far more people dying because you do not develop medicine, you do not develop proper infrastructure. These are tangible harms to people that end up happening at the end of the day for all these reasons incredibly proud to propose.
Okay, thank you, Opposition Whip, for that speech. Now, to conclude the case of the opposition, I call upon the opposition reply. Hear, hear.
All right. Am I both audible and visible? Okay, thanks. Yeah, then I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Under government, I can no longer watch Dirk Nowitzki play basketball. But after listening to 18 minutes of airballs and fouls, I don't even want to watch him. Because just like Nowitzki, their case is a miss. Sick mothers and children die, subhuman races continue to be oppressed, and individuals are stripped from happiness. With that said, let's go right on to the first issue as to which this debate should be judged upon on terms of the development of society versus discrimination that happens. And ultimately, it boils down to who is saved and who is killed. On government, they say that they prevent human atrocities and suffering. Because about 0.1 second into Alex's speech, he says that human suffering is caused by development and innovation. He also says that bad intentions are ultimately also influenced by the concept of speciality, and therefore, if you just remove speciality, remove bad intentions, and therefore you don't have human suffering. Why is this not true? We don't think that this is an exclusive harm. Trying to be special and trying to be better, we think this is a self-interest of all people, because all three speakers on our bench have told you that everyone is naturally greedy and everyone has self-interest. Then why is this greed utilized for the worst, and why is it worse under their world, and why is self-interest going to play out to cause even greater human atrocities in their world? Let's say first notice that people in power will benefit off of the narrative. Note that it's not just limited to the government, but also in just high job positions where they have a lot of power or they have a lot of credibility but from the public. And why will people die or suffer more under their world? Because they don't even have the illusion of agency, because people won't rebel, people won't protest, and people can't propose counter policies or counter solutions as to the current system of government. And all this goes unresponded, and that's why ultimately development occurs under our world, and that's why we get things like agency, because you feel restricted, because you were born with desires, and we have justice, and it's not tangible on their side. And Alex's last-minute characterization ruins their most important argument. If communities rely on traditional ways of living, their problems still exist. For example, racism is not I'm the better human. Racism is that there are subhuman different communities that cause certain differences to be outlined between different groups of people. And they are not recognized, meaning that harms will still happen under their world. You're not able to resolve these different types of differences because differences are still apparent, and we think that you're not able to help the most vulnerable people. And that's how we get justice under our world exclusively, because you're able to get things like because justice is achieved under our world, because now you're able to help people knowing that in the status quo that they're the people who need help. We think that discrimination, sure, even if it doesn't happen on your side, the vulnerable remain vulnerable because they're the ones who are seen as inferior if you try to help them anyways. And they can't say that people have a natural desire and everyone will have the equal desire to want to help one another and therefore want to help the vulnerable as well, because we would say that as human, because that inherently goes against human nature, because human nature isn't necessarily to help everyone, but all necessarily just also benefit off of themselves, as characterized to both speakers in terms of who wants to be more special, who wants to be better in this world. And to live the same is to live in a dystopia. And that's why not only do you have a dystopia, but you also have one that lacks development, only reinforces the discrimination and loses the debate. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, opposition reply, for that speech. Now to conclude the debate as a whole, I call upon the government reply. Hear, hear.
Yeah, is this clearly visible and audible?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Think of the moment when OpWhip concedes retrospective harms. Ironically, they still say that it doesn't matter because the Holocaust will not happen again, that slavery has already been abolished. But 6 million people already died on their side. And that is what you have to weigh in this debate, because this is literally a preferential road motion. So there is a comparison. 6 million people don't have to die on our road. In their road, they prevent the sports industry from its downfall. I don't think that that is like an actual way to weigh this debate. Cover operation is clear who wins. First question on suffering. There are 3 things that operation pose you here. Number 1 on this randomness quibble, that resources and roles will be assigned randomly. like we literally like feared against this? No, because if it is distributed randomly, then some people still get more than others. Some people are still better off than others. That is literally inequality which we oppose via this like law of Jante. But number two, it doesn't matter, because what Alex tells you is that randomness is not instrumentalized for bad impacts anyways. No response comes out from Hannah. I think we end this issue. Second of all, on disabled people, here's the thing. Again, sure, disabled people might face get a sense of status quo. That was not the case throughout human history. Because for the last few thousand years, not like void of the last few decades, disabled people were literally killed. They were literally segregated from other quote-unquote normal people because of the apparent differences that opposition talked about. We pointed this out. What we told you then was that disabled people don't have to face this discrimination in the first place, which is retrospectively the weighing of cure for our side. Finally, they somehow make a stance shift from Singan's concession that discrimination doesn't exist in opposition with, that elites will still have bad incentives. Why is this not the case? Number one, we already preempted this, right? You don't have the incentive to still discriminate against other people because you yourself buy into this narrative that you're not special. Number two, because you don't have the incentive to be greedy anyways, right? Number two, even if you do, we already showed you why you don't have the capacity to do so, because every other person doesn't buy into this. Even if Hitler still claims that Jewish people are inferior to, for example, the Aryan race, because other people still buy into this law of Jante, he doesn't get support. He cannot rise into power. That was what you had to weigh at the end of this debate. What are the impacts? First, Otweb says that slavery has been abolished. This is a perverse role motion. You still have to defend all the historical harms of slavery. Number two, they say that you only consider your community. This was not Alex's argument, and they weighted in the wrong way. The fact that you care about your community doesn't mean that you discriminate against other communities. We literally preempted this in first, because sure, right? You still have different skin colors. We told you that you don't care about skin colors. You still see people as equal regardless of skin colors anyways. Like, I literally don't see the point of the response, especially when this is a response coming from Otweb to PM. On innovation briefly then, what did we tell you that they never responded back to? Firstly, that there's an opportunity cost, that people who had talent, people who had the potential to innovate, didn't get the opportunities in the status quo, speaking from a historical perspective. Number two, that innovation is random. That, for example, certain discoveries are made by random chemists spilling random chemicals on another random chemical. That, but already flow of time, new resources and materials are discovered, and that was what led to innovation in human history. That was Alex's weighing. Number three, that abilities can still flourish. That people who are good at doctors will still be doctors. But the thing is, doctors will not be seen as more valuable and special compared to janitors because they treat their value as equal. But even if they take the clash of innovation, what is the impact of this? Why does innovation outweigh our conclusive impacts of, again, the reducing of suffering, the reducing of poverty, and the reducing of genocide, which, again, LO made the explicit concession to at the very top of the case? That was one question that they failed to answer. They therefore failed to win this debate.